Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for attending this online session. Okay, here I go. On the 28th of January 1948, a Douglas DC-3 plane carrying 28 migrant farm workers from the US back to Mexico, together with 3 crew members and an immigration officer, crashed at Los Gatos Canyon, California, killing all on board. While the 4 US nationals were given family funerals and state recognition, including the 13th fall ceremony of the American flag, the unidentified migrants' remains were buried in a mass grave at Holy Cross Cemetery, with a plaque referring to them just as 28 Mexican citizens. Their families were never officially informed, and their life stories never untraced. Such neglectful anonymity was denounced by folk composer Woody Guthrie in his protest song "Deportee," first popularized by Pete Seeger and then over the years by John Baez, Bob Dylan, Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash, or Bruce Springsteen, among others. The lyrics condemn explicitly the precarity of these Mexican workers and the poor media coverage of the tragedy by consistently emphasizing their otherness through the term deportees. California-born Chicano writer and activist Tim Hernandez admits he had never considered that the impact of this song would last 6 decades until it found the grandson of migrant farm workers moved by a question posed in the lyrics: "Who are these friends all scattered like dry leaves?" And this was enough to go searching for the answer. And as his hideous progeny goes forth and prosper, the result being as fragmentary as the creature imagined by Mary Shelley 2 centuries ago, since Hernandez embarks on a complex interdisciplinary investigation to try assembling these nameless bodies with the background stories, which explains the dispersed and polyphonic style of the final text. This is a long quote, but I think very clarifying. Despite the investigation team's best efforts, in the end it was a patchwork job. Names were dismembered as the bodies they belonged to. Adding a name at the end of his name would turn Tomás Gracia de Aviña into a female, Tomasa, with that arm with his torso, and this foot with that ankle. And now the last name Lara too got a makeover, and the Tolstoy Caballero Guadalupe Ramírez Lara was now Guadalupe Laura Ramírez, a female. Ramón Paredes was truncated into Ramón Pérez, this head with that neck. What about Apolonio Placencia? That finger looks a good fit with his hand. Different shade of brown, yes, but close enough. Little did Apolonio know that in death he'd become Italian, Placenti. And this was how their names would go down according to official records: Apolonio Placenti, Guadalupe Laura Ramírez, Tomasa Aviña de Gracia, 1 Italian and 2 women. By the morning of January 29, 1948, news of the plane crash had made its way across the country, from California to New Orleans. It had the makings of a bad joke. By print, radio, and word of mouth, there was an assault on this continent who hadn't heard of the story of the 2 World War II pilots, an immigration officer, a stewardess, and 28 deportees who exploded in an airplane in some unknown California hillside called Los Gatos Canyon. End quote. Inserted within the critical framework of necropolitics formulated by Mbembe, my analysis of Hernandez's text explores the intersections of life, death, and mourning in migratory contexts. As an expansion and radicalization of the Foucaultian notion of biopower, Mbembe conceives necropower as the ultimate manifestation of sovereignty, quote, "the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die." End quote. A concept that helps account for the prevalence of death in contemporary societies, especially in systems of violence and domination, where the political, in the guise of war, resistance, fight against terror, or border securitization, makes the murder of its enemy its primary objective. Along with mass killings, genocides, and exterminations fostered by racial supremacy, Mbembe considers that necropolitics is administered through small doses of death, through which entire populations are subjugated to an existence of extreme precarity that confers them the status of living dead or to put it into George Agamben's terms, a condition of bare life. The production of these death words, Mbembe argues, is assisted by three factors. First, necropolitics produces a necroeconomy through which modern capitalism exposes populations to deadly dangers and risks so as to obtain maximum profit from their exploitation. Second, necropolitics relies on confinement of certain populations using the camp system as a means of surveillance, control, and discipline, and subjecting them to this permanent condition of life and death. Third, necropolitics produces death at a large scale through mechanisms like state terror, shared use of violence, or predation of natural resources, and moral justifications like preservation of democracy or territorial sovereignty. Devised as a response to the after-war labor shortage, the Bracero program signed between Mexico and US to hire those 28 workers and millions like them during the harvest seasons from 1942 and 1968 might qualify as one of these death wells, provided the exploitation and daily humiliations the inmates went through. The Texas and California labor camps recreated in Hernandez's text were very much sites of necro power, where racialized others were treated as livestock, herded into lines for mass examination, into booths for mass fumigation, into buses for mass transportation. He describes the experience of Luis Miranda Cuevas, one of these guest workers killed at the plane crash upon his arrival at the Santa Fe Bridge Receiving Center on the dusty edge of El Paso Juarez border. To officiate the passing, the Bracero program welcoming committee would initiate him with a ritual delousing of DDT, a powerful spray insecticide sprayed from the top of his black hair into his ears, across his eyelids, into his nostrils, down his cold, trembling, naked body, into the creases and folds of his pulp nobles, hair follicles between his fingers and toes, the soles of his feet, and back again. Before handing Luis back his clothes, they would first be wiped in a bath of Zyklon B, the same chemical agent used to extinguish human lives in the gas chambers of Nazi Germany. Hernandez's powerful invocation of the deadly methods employed in Nazi Germany is highly significant if considered from the critical perspective of necropower. Mbembe addresses precisely the Holocaust as a clear example of necropolitical practices where racism functioned as a technology that facilitated the state's administration and management of death, assisted by modern technologies, engineering, medical, architectural technologies, that resulted in the efficiency of the death regimes. On a similar vein, Luis' naked body, exposed to the denigrating inspection of the camp's authorities, stands as the living signifier of the Braceros' bare life, stripped of their legal status and transformed by sovereign power into a dehumanized existence without rights. It's a long quote too, but I think it's quite significant and illuminating. Days later, on arriving at the Santa Fe Bridge Receiving Center on the dusty edge of El Paso Juarez border, Luis found himself in yet another line. This time he was made strip naked, carry his belongings in his hands, and wait with the rest of the workers, as exposed under the white glaring eye of the desert sun. If Casimira would see me now, he couldn't help but laugh. Though any chance of lasting modesty would be shattered in the next few minutes, Luis shielded his crotch with his clothes and kept his gaze straight ahead, as did everyone else, until the moment of his evaluation. The evaluation was a test of degradation. If a worker could endure the test, they most certainly would endure life as a bracero in the north. Luis' upper eyelids were turned inside out and inspected for conjunctivitis. Then his mouth was prodded and examined for sores or abscesses, any signs of declining health. If his body had any scars on it, even just one, he would be turned away and scorned. We don't want troublemakers here. Next, his testicles were gripped and kneaded by strange fingers, after which he was made to bend over and spread his cheeks so that his anus could be scrutinized and prodded with tongue depressor. His hands were then examined for calluses, a sure sign of whether or not a man was capable of hard work. Often, men would cut their hands or work a shovel handle days before their examination just to build up a good callus. Lewis would pass his test and eventually be admitted to work in the United States. Seen this way, immigrants seem to enter the realm of American micropower, and the border becomes a meeting point between life and death. Despite the US government promises, Mexican seasonal workers suffered exploitation and abuses from their employers, racial discrimination, dangerous exposure to agrochemicals, and other manifestations of what Lauren Berlant termed slow death. That is, the gradual deterioration and wearing out of lives, bodies, and environments under contemporary regimes of global capitalism. The very name they are known by, braceros, suggests their arms, brazos, their bodies were extensions of the product, food crops, they produce and thus equally offered for capitalist consumption. And yet, though their work generated visible profit for the nation as migrant and racialized laborers, braceros were consistently erased from public political life, and once their contracts were terminated, they were disposed and deported. And here is this quote that expresses this regime of expendability, disposability at its best. A representative of the Agricultural Labor Bureau of the San Joaquin Valley offered this insight. We're asking for labor only at certain times of the year, at the peak of our harvest, and the class of labor we want is the kind we can send home when we get through with them. Douglas DC-3, the plane in which the braceros were occasionally deported after the seasonal work ended, participated also in this regime of expendability and waste, as these models were part of the surplus aircraft that would not be used for other purposes after World War II. Disposable technology for disposable migrant bodies and lives. In line with the work of many activists and artists in the US-Mexico border, Hernandez's work evidences that in the necropolitical regime of the frontier, not only these Latino lives, but also their afterlives are rendered as disposable. In his efforts to mourn collectively and individually these unacknowledged losses by uncovering their untold background stories, he challenges the fragile condition of rememberability for people that do not count as citizens, and confronts Judith Butler's famous question about, quote, who counts as a livable life and a livable death, end quote. Excavating in the unmourned life stories of these anonymous victims seems like an ironic contestation to the mass grave where these 28 deportees were buried for 70 years without names, identifications, or rituals. According to Jenny Atkins, missing and dead migrants, to a great extent doubly disappeared, challenge state control of information as they evade official records by having their names, addresses, or families disconnected from these bodies. The responses to these corpses and the practices and protocols of their identification reveal a tension between the care and concern they arouse and the exclusionary politics they reflect. So in this light, Hernandez's work is an equally destabilizing initiative which contrasts with the invisibility and opaqueness of the processes through which migrant remains are buried. Though the 32 passengers on board of the plane met the same accidental death at Los Gatos Canyon, the differential value of their lives on account of their class, race, and nationality generated an uneven allocation of grievability. This is how Judith Butler refers to this, between the 4 US nationals and the 28 Mexican deportees, depriving some humans of the rituals couples with a dehumanizing attempt against those already deprived of their cultural dignity. So in spite of the claims about a mortalist humanism that equates us all in death and loss within a tenuous we, Butler denounces a hierarchy of grief, one that reveals that the alleged common vulnerability of all humans is unequivocally embedded within already existing structures of inequality that condition both our lives and afterlives. Drawing on the critical framework proposed by Achille Mbembe and Judith Butler, we could thus argue that there is a necro-power dynamics regulating the practice of memorialization, where some subjects are deemed legitimately grievable and memorable, and some others are not. This dynamics is powerfully at play in border territories and migratory contexts, which operate as axis of differentiation and constitutes the basic foundation for biopolitical and necropolitical practices. To be rich, someone has to be poor. To be healthy, somebody has to be sick. In order to live, others have to die. In order to be remembered, others have to be forgotten. In a typically ekphrastic fashion, the victims' names are scattered on the page, just as their bodies were scattered like dry leaves over Los Gatos Canyon. But even admitting to the importance of Hernandez's political gesture in naming the anonymous deportees and trying to dignify their memory by connecting their bodies with their background identities, I agree with Erkins on the ambiguity of such politics of registration and documentation, since, quote, the use of names both distinguishes individuals as equal and of value, and at the same time, in a sense, reduces each person to bare life. End quote. It is then necessary to address this double bind that positions these expendable migrant experiences as simultaneously absent and present, invisible and hypervisible, included and excluded, thus inviting a reconsideration of vulnerability in resistance or as resistance, drawing on Butler. By attending not only to their names, but also to their truncated life affects and aspirations, Hernandez reconstructs not only this deportees' bare life, but also the migrant agency, articulated in the language of humanity, still heard and spoken in those very spaces where the boundaries of the human are tested. Among the prison laborers who witnessed the crash and helped searching for pieces of human remains, there circulated the folk legend, a Mexican folk legend of La Huesera, the bone woman, who wanders around canyons collecting bones of dead animals and people and puts them back together with whatever bones she does have. As if impersonating the mythical figure of La Huesera, Hernandez embarks on an act of remembering, both in the sense of assembling, piecing together the scattered bodily members with their life stories, and of memorializing their ungrievable deaths. Through the interdisciplinary and polyphonic project behind this novel, including photographs, music, official written records, and oral testimonies, Hernandez vindicates what Butler calls alternative modes of public hearing and seeing that illuminate the counter-memories of those silenced and erased within the necropolitical regimes of globalization. We would have to interrogate the emergence and vanishing of the human at the limits of what we can know, we can hear, we can see, we can sense. We need to create a sense of the public in which oppositional voices are not feared, degraded, or dismissed, but valued for the instigation to a sensate democracy they occasionally performed. End quote. And I would like to finish with one of these oppositional voices, which since 1948 has kept on denouncing the necropolitical violence against these anonymous deportees.
The crops are all in, the peaches are rotting, the oranges are piled in their creosote dumps. They're flying you back to the Mexico border to pay all your money to wait back again. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. Oh, they'll call you the deportee.
My father's own father, he waded that river. They took all the money he made in his life. My brothers and sisters, they worked in your orchards, rode the big trucks till they lay down and died. sky plane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon, a fireball of lightning that shook all our hills. Who are all these friends who are falling like dry leaves? The radio said they're just deportees. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita, adios mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. Oh, they will call you, they'll be deportees.
Okay, and that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm ready for comments or questions.